Hello and welcome to the Shakti Hour, a podcast on Ram Dass's Be Here Now network, where I speak with women about their personal experience on the spiritual path. My name is Melanie, and today I'm sharing a conversation with Sangha member Ganga Devi Braun. Ganga and I met last year at a retreat at Hanuman Gardens, and we stayed in touch and had a really nice conversation late this spring, where we talked about social media and Instagram, nonlinear time, and got to hear some of her personal experience and story of growing up on an ashram. I hope you'll enjoy hearing more from Ganga and find links to contact her on the Shakti Hour page. Thanks so much for listening to the Shakti Hour. Please do remember to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and do leave us a positive review. Also, if you'd like to become a subscriber, you can follow the Shakti Hour at patreon.com/Shakti Hour and join in with a subscription to receive special monthly rewards and help support some upcoming special series on sacred music and sacred earth that I am producing with a professional podcast producer over the coming months. You can also find me on Instagram, Shakti Hour Podcast, and on Facebook, Shakti Hour, and as always at BeHereNowNetwork.com. Thanks so much for listening. Now enjoy Ganga Devi Braun. So here we are.
Yeah.
I saw your post this morning.
Yeah, Instagram, who knew it would be such an outlet
Seriously.
of expression.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It feels like it's cathartic in some way, no? Just to be able to put it somewhere and know that somebody's going to grab it.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's been really helpful for me. And specifically like doing this 100-day project of self-expression and selecting the topic of earth medicine and recognizing that everything comes from the earth. So anything that's arising for me can be medicine and is from the earth, and it all counts. And then having like the structure of the 100-day project to hold me accountable for deep diving. That's been like a really cathartic experience because my whole life I'm able to stay in my head and stay in my rational self. And I'm happiest when I'm in a state of self-expression, but sometimes I'm just stuck in analysis. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so this practice on Instagram has been really, really healing and helpful and cathartic for sure.
And where did the 100 days come from? Where did that plan come from?
I don't know. I have a couple of friends in the Bay Area who I think that there's an artist out there who kind of started the 100-day project for her own art and practice. But I don't actually know her or who she is. But I saw a lot of my friends starting to do this and last year and I also wanted to start, but I didn't have the ability for follow through. And this year I saw some people starting it up again. And it's amazing to see how people's art and how people's expression can evolve and change with 100 days of showing up fully. And I knew that with all the challenges that I'm going through in my personal life and my family life right now, that it was my responsibility to myself to self-reflect every day and to nourish myself, and that having other people's eyeballs on me was both a practice of vulnerability, which is also really healing, and also, again, like an accountability measure. So yeah, I just started it on a whim a couple of months ago, and yeah, it's been really amazing.
What's so cool about that is that, what I like about the vulnerability of that on the daily thing is that that's what art is, right? And then you're kind of get to see that, okay, maybe there's 5 of those 100 that really feel like Oh yeah. That's really like, yeah, I got the thing together there. And for any kind of practice, I think especially on social media, in that flow that we're in right now, today, this moment, it's all too easy to edit and capture only the 5. But the truth of the matter is that and with any practice, with a meditation practice or artistic practice, is that the other 95 are essential to the 5 that really hold the potency of what you're really looking for. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe you're like a less harsh critic on yourself than I am, and maybe your percentage is higher out of 100 than 5%. But at least in my experience, it feels like, working like that, when you're working, when you're writing, when you're creating, that it really comes down to, showing up for it every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That sentiment always brings to mind Maria Popova, who is like such an amazing, prolific creator. She has brain pickings for anyone who's unfamiliar. She has a remarkable mind and is constantly putting out phenomenal analysis and expression and relationship with a lot of like dead old thinkers. And on a podcast, I heard her quoting Thoreau about productivity, where Thoreau in one of his journals said, like, a chicken isn't always laying eggs. A chicken is often just eating seeds and, floating around in dirt and doing all kinds of random stuff that a chicken does, and is not always laying an egg. But then all of the other things contribute to the effortlessness of egg laying. And that's what it feels like for me with all forms of my outward expression. I know that I'm honing my voice, and I know that I'm honing the sense of who I want to be in the world for myself and for others. And it's been remarkable because even the things that I post, I do this as a morning practice. And it's like one of the first things I do when I'm laying in bed on my phone. I record a little gratitude voice recording that I send to a friend of mine. And then I get it on Instagram and I find whatever image I want to post and I write something. And I don't think about it. I hardly edit it. And it's still kind of in that numinous space of my sleeping time. And sometimes I'll go back and I'll be like, oh, that was a grammatical thing or whatever. But mostly I just don't touch them, because what I want more than anything is to give permission to people to really take an honest, deep dive into their own human experience and whatever it is that's challenging in that moment for them. And I also really want the people who care about me to understand what my inner world, so that they can understand better how I'm showing up for them. Specifically in this really challenging time of my father dying, like, a lot of people are reaching out to me all the time, with a lot of love, but a lot of the time it's asking questions, like, how are you? What's going on? Like, what's going on with your dad? How's your mom? What's, my stepmother Durga doing? How's my sister? All these questions, I so frequently cannot respond to them. Like I have so many messages in Facebook and in my texts and in emails that I have been unable to individually respond to, because it takes so much out of me to give a genuine, honest response. And I don't want it to be bottled. I don't want it to be formulaic. I want to be honest. And I also have other things that I need to be doing with my day other than corresponding with people. And I trust that if those people understand me and they know me and they love me, that they won't be offended. So it's also kind of this lifeline of me casting out this super honest vulnerability to everyone who I know and who loves me, and trusting that they will understand me better from that place, and that will help them engage with me better and help any future communication that we have just immediately drop into a beautiful, more authentic, deeper space. Because if anything of this like last year and a half has taught me is that I don't have the time or the energy for superficial shit anymore. Like just, life is so precious, and I'm not willing to have a ton of small talk anymore. Although like I love pop culture, and I love, I can talk about Star Trek forever and like minutia, and I love the sweet details of people's lives, and I love talking about just things that were exciting that happened in someone's day. But I don't need to, but I want it to be from a place of like genuine open-heartedness. And since I started this project, I've noticed that people who do follow me on Instagram, when I talk to them, we immediately drop into this beautiful space of them acknowledging what I've been doing. And then often they'll come to me and be like, I'm going through this thing, and this has been so helpful for me to see your reflection. And we're able to immediately talk about whatever it is that's painful that they're going through, and not sugarcoat it, and not pretend that it's either, I think sometimes when we're going through really difficult things, we can pretend that it's okay and we can bypass it. But sometimes we also feel like we need to be miserable all the time. Like having a parent who's dying, people see me joyful sometimes, and I can tell that I can sometimes perceive that people are judging me for being like really joyful in whatever moment I'm in. And then they bring up my dad, and it totally pulls me out of a flow state.
Right.
And it's
wait, yes, so you're supposed to be feeling this way now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're supposed to be grieving right now. And I'm like, well, my father is like completely like immersed in like Maharaji's love right now. So like no one in this entire situation wants me to be suffering. Doesn't mean I'm not suffering.
Right. And there's a good Ram Dass story about that. He tells that story about, well, do you need to be dying all the time? Or could you be maybe dying for a few minutes a day and then also living? Yeah. Could you? But honestly, I'm just getting emotional about your relationship with social media. I mean, it's warming my heart so much, because there is this generational gap where I felt first really resistant. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm like, not into the system, right? That's my programming. My teenage programming is like, fuck the system, like, and so there was a huge resistance. And then I stepped into a feeling of, oh, I get it. This could be this thing that like you're talking about. This could be a conversation starter. This could be a place for self-expression. This could be all these things. But then, the holding of the space for that dialogue to continue outside of this thing, outside of the device, that's where the potency sometimes gets a bit lost. So I'm curious about, I think that the 100 Days project is nice because you're giving it a nice structure to lean on. So you have that structure regardless of what conversations end up coming out of it ultimately for you. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering about that experience of, because I feel blessed, as are you, to have a great, community of people who are present and whose intention is to be present and available to one another in love. But what about that, the feeling of there not being an audience or not being a response? Do you know what I'm saying? That thing that maybe you haven't experienced it that way. Maybe you just have lived in a nice community that has supported you through that medium. But yeah. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do. And it's funny. This is a strange response, but I think that my very enduring faith in nonlinear time helps that a lot. I've spent many years really cultivating I guess, somewhat divergent relationship with time as a nonlinear system that we experience in a linear way, but trusting that it's not linear, and trusting that if I put something out there that is authentic and meaningful to me, that if it's supposed to be of service to someone, it will be, and it doesn't have to be immediately. And yeah, and this is important for me to hear myself say, because it's the truth for me, but I get caught up in really being uncomfortable with being scrutinized. And so for me, it's not so much, it's like if nobody responds to something that I put out there, I'm so fine with that. I have no problem with it. But I am concerned about people disliking or like being critical of what I'm doing, not in a way that is like anyone can be critical, and it's fine. And a lot of the time it's people's projections. But if somebody were to point out to me that something that I did was deeply problematic, that brings up a lot of shadow for me to work with that I'm terrified of working on. But it's so important that I work on it. And I get to a place of embracing it. But that's like my biggest enemy is being is putting something out there and not feeling like I'm enough of an authority, or I haven't done enough of my own self-work to be valid in expressing what I'm expressing, because we do live in such a critical and often non-constructive kind of internet sphere.
Right. Well, and then that's a lot of responsibility, you know. I'm going to face my shadow and work on it because some person said had a negative response or non-response, you know, or there's no response to, you know, I posted that thing and nobody liked it, you know, nobody responded. But in that way, you know, coming from a spiritual seeker or somebody who's on a spiritual path, I like the way that you're framing it, that you're using it to engage your own practice. Like you're engaging your own personal development, your own relationship with spirit. And I love also the idea that this is not instant time, that the time can come and can come back, and that the message can be received and retrieved and reworked and held in the right moment.
Yeah. And if the internet truly is forever, as people threaten us with saying all the time, if it truly is forever, then like that's such a relief for those of us who are putting, you know, art or self-expression out there, not for attention and gain, but for hoping that it can be really meaningful and nourishing to people. Because in the past, our ancestors did not have a similar assurance of longevity. But I think about like future digital archaeologists finding my Tumblr page from when I was like 17. And I really check in with myself and I'm like, do I feel ashamed of my self-expression from that time? Or can I really own it as a part of my evolution? And I've been asking myself that question since I was younger. And yeah, I feel like maybe some parts of me would be embarrassed, but my truest self loves myself. And I'm grateful that like so many old weird pictures are on Facebook of me. And I'm grateful that that there's like evidence of my growth and my evolution, because I always want to be a different person than I have been. And I'm grateful for the people that I have been that have led me to who I am today. And I'm really excited to meet myself in the future. And the internet allows us to self-reflect in a really unique way. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. See, that's so beautiful. There's this, there was a Portlandia episode not long ago where Fred Armisen is trying to figure out how old he is. And he's got all of these different kinds of mini discs and thumb drives and all these things. He's trying to figure out like all this time has passed that isn't held on the internet. So see, there's this, I have half of a life without that in those stories are held in the people in my relationships. And maybe somebody has some pictures somewhere, you know. I was talking to Raghu about that the other day, just, you know, just considering, had Maharaji been now, like the documentation, you know, there's so many pictures of him as it stands, but you know, just considering what that would have been like, you know, for people to be in that reflection. But the way that you're looking at it is so, again, is so based in this personal spiritual evolution, and seeing the changes in yourself and seeing that reflection. But there is still that accountability aspect, you know, which is something that, honestly, in my 20s, I'm grateful that I don't have to be accountable for that time. You know what I'm saying? Like, that was not a time beyond the things that I officially captured that I necessarily would want full documentation of. And sometimes I wonder about that wildness, you know, with this idea of, you know, you're working with earth medicine, and I wonder about that privacy, that wildness that happens in youth, or at least it was allowed to happen for me. And what that, you know, you still have the choice whether or not to document it, but what do you think?
Well, and like, we're always editing our presence on the internet, and there's so much that is in my life that never reaches any media outlets.
Right.
And I'm grateful for that, because just as we choose, you know, what we're going to wear when we go out of the house every day, and we don't have to be naked all the time unless, you know, we choose to, and we're in a context where that's appropriate. Right. We get to choose what parts of our bodies we expose. And I think that it's important not to be like phony or false, but to acknowledge that no one is capable of living their entire lives on the internet. Like, that just sounds impossibly exhausting. I feel like there's maybe an experimental, like, Norwegian documentary where somebody did that for a long time, but for the most part, we're very much curating our presentation all the time. So that's an important thing to always just acknowledge, especially when you're looking at other people's feeds and you're like, oh my gosh, they're so creative and so beautiful, and like everything that happens in their life is so is like wrapped up in a nice package of aesthetic or expression, and like no one's lives are like that. But I also, like, there is a degree of, you know, the wildness and the I mean, definitely, like, I express a lot of vulnerability on my page, and I have some friends who do Facebook Lives where they talk about, like, yesterday's sexual awakening, and like, you know, what their like tantric practices are doing for them, and like are very, very personal and very vulnerable, and that's something that I don't think it would serve me to like, I don't feel a need to share that. But I recognize that for some people, sharing those wild parts of their lives is also really healing and cathartic for other people.
Right. But through story. I mean, it is also through story, and part of what you're offering are these little love letters, you know, and it was reminding me of, I took this class in college on Japanese women's Heian period literature. And this is just, you know, this ancient time period where these women would write these, they had no expression in the world except their presentation, except the way that they were presented. And then, so they would, and they were, you know, held in the home, you know, they had this, so, but they would write these incredibly, you know, detailed descriptions of, they were writing out Instagram accounts, basically. They were and, you know, it was these incredibly detailed descriptions of what people were wearing and what they said and what the room was like, and it became this really beautiful, thick, poetic document of detail, and then in that expression of feeling, but kind of buried in there. So it's not like it's new, right?
Yeah, no, not at all.
It's not new that we want to notice, that we want to observe each other, that we want to share how we see things down to details, that we want to look closely at one another and our experience. That isn't like a new desire. And so having some sense of spiritual awakeness to it can allow it to not be harmful, really. Some of these women were brutal to other women. It's in the hands of the person using the tool, right?
Yeah, of course.
How we can do that.
Neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your background. Share with us a little bit about your upbringing, your story, and how you got to be where you are now.
Yeah. So I'm actually across the street from the community that I was raised in, which is Kashi Ashram, which is a Neem Karoli Baba ashram that has an interesting history in the whole Neem Karoli Baba lineage satsang, which might be for another time. But it's an amazing interfaith community here in Florida. It's on 80 acres of land, and there's like just temples to so many different traditions all around the grounds. And both of my parents were founders of the community here. My father was one of the people who was with Neem Karoli Baba in person, and he was like one of the temple makers and tree planters when they first came down here, and it was just like sandy scrublands and like swampy kind of jungle. And now it's just this beautiful space, and I'm emphasizing that as part of my origin, because I'm here because my father came back here to die. And, it's called Kashi, which is the ancient name of Varanasi, which is the city in India on the banks of the Ganga where people go to die. And from some of my earliest memories here have been of caring for people dying of AIDS. We had a hospice house, just actually, I can like see it from my driveway here, the house that used to be our hospice house, the river house, we would call it, in reference to the Ganga. And it was for people whose families had completely abandoned them because of their contraction of HIV and were dying of AIDS. So that's where I am now. I'm physically also just across the street from Kashi in my mother's Tibetan Buddhist Dharma Center. So my father was a devotee of Neem Karoli Baba, and my mother was as well, but she didn't know him in the flesh. She came to the teaching through Ram Dass and Krishna Das in the 70s. And then in the last few decades, she's really, really deeply immersed herself in Tibetan Buddhism. So we have a Dharma center on one side of our duplex, and the other side is where we live. And it's an amazing intersection of these lineages. And I know Raghu's been talking a lot about Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche on his podcast, and he's been really touched by who he was. And that's also the root guru of the Nyingma lineage that my mother is a part of. Okay. So it's a really, my parents really created a very rich foundation for me and my sister to come into. And they're also both mental health professionals. They're both therapists. So I was like really born into an incarnation that supported my emotional intelligence and my spiritual path.
How cognizant are you or were you of being kind of reaping the benefits of that lineage? Like, so being the fruit of that time of 1965 to 74, right? Mm-hmm. Being the fruit of the labors of the people that went ahead of you.
Yeah. As a child, I guess I was pretty aware of it. I was really fascinated with the 60s growing up. I was fascinated with the hippie stuff. Mirabai Bush is my godmother, and I remember going to her house, and there were like always just really cool books about the 60s that I would read, and I was always like really grateful. Definitely for the spiritual lineage that I was in. I've never really had a period of rebellion. I had a period in high school of like, I I think during high school, I really felt that I had to normalize myself for self-preservation. So that was the only time that I felt really disconnected from my spirituality. But then I was able to drop right back into it in college. And so I never had a full rejection, which a lot of people in, who are second generation in these really amazing but pretty far out kind of lineages, reject it for a while and then have to figure out how to reintegrate it. I never really had that, but it's actually just been the last year and a half that I've fully come to really, really appreciate exactly what you said. Like seeds were planted in the 60s, and a lot of people who were really active and involved in the 60s that I talked to, especially people who were very politically and like socially involved, but not very spiritually involved, feel that I've heard a lot of people express that they feel that it was a waste, that all their efforts were a waste, and that they haven't seen the world come about that they wanted to create and that was motivating them. But my experience is that like seeds were planted, and when seeds are planted, it takes a while sometimes for them to germinate. But I see like the fruiting happening everywhere right now. And especially what really awakened me to that was becoming pretty good friends with I think he's now like the co-chair of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and really dropping into Buckminster Fuller's legacy and recognizing how many amazing young people are living in evidence of that, and how much work has been done because of Buckminster Fuller's legacy that would never have been done if we didn't have time to like allow it to unfold, like we needed decades to be at the place that we are right now. And I really appreciate that. And then this last year, just really being embraced by Ram Dass and the whole, the foundation and Raghu and everyone within that branch of the Neem Karoli Baba satsang has again really deepened my appreciation for the groundwork that was set to allow me to be the person that I am now. And I'm so grateful too that I don't have this resentment of like not having met him in the flesh, because that would just be really painful if I had that. I'm happy to be here now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just so. It's so, excuse me, it's so fascinating, the perception of time and back to the internet and social media and how things move so quickly now. It's like all so relative. But when I was speaking to Lama Siltram last year, I asked her about that, and she was very hopeful. She was like, there's a yoga studio in every little town in America. I mean, there was nothing. There was Naropa. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And a couple little strongholds, and so to that degree with spirituality, it is that foundation is out there, and you can go do a semester at Naropa and meet these people and take that further, and building that structure, in the world to hold more space for those ideas to evolve. And Buckminster Fuller, I'm obsessed with the Expo 67, the World's Fair that was in Montreal in 1967, and he built the biosphere there. I'm obsessed with that whole experience and with the biosphere, which then burned down, and then Robert Altman made a movie in it, and now it's there, and they turned it into a science center. But just that idea that that was like a futuristic idea 50 years ago, right? It was 51 years ago. It was the future.
Yeah.
And so that kind of disillusionment with the follow through needed, or how things come together, it's like, it feels like this is kind of a theme that's coming out of what we're talking about around with your 100 Days project, and time not being linear, and being in this moment. Last night I had the opportunity to go to this really interesting gathering of people who are doing some heavy duty work on healing the earth around the globe, and from all different cultures, and working like with the UN and stuff like that. And there was this one man there who has been taking elders around to all these sacred sites around the globe and doing these healing ceremonies with the earth. And I was just like, whoa, I had no idea that was happening, on any kind of official level. But I mean, they're really systematically going to these mapped out energetic places with tribal elders from around the globe and doing these ceremonies to heal that vibration. And so I'm going a roundabout way to get to this, and I was speaking with Ram Dass earlier this year, and I was talking to him about this moment in time and how there seems to be more capacity for awakening, but less structure to support it. So, he said it much more eloquently than that, but it was basically that idea. And so, I guess I'm just curious on your perspective on that, because you're kind of coming into that energetic field. You were supported. You were born into this place where you could have, like you said, a temple for every resource, for every spiritual possibility right on your landscape right there. And then you can go to Naropa for a semester and access all these things. Naropa is a real thing that exists. But then there is this other level of disillusionment in the energetic field, or in the minds and hearts of a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that wasn't really a question, but what it is, it is part of what this podcast is for me, and the reason to allow this exploration of conversations with women and with feminine wisdom is that I feel that allows for that kind of gray area. It allows for that webbing to be connecting, like you were talking about, all your disparate parts that you felt like you could finally integrate. And it's okay to have this kind of webbing idea. And so I'm just curious about your reflection on that for this moment, and for the moment of changing the earth, that moment of despair, yet creating something to support us all.
Yeah. So there are two, I guess, different worldview frameworks that come to mind as a response to that. And the first is about the age of Aquarius, which, like, I was just having this conversation yesterday with someone where in the 60s people thought, like, oh, the age of Aquarius was like, it was going to be love and harmony and peace across the board for everyone, which is always what people want, but never what fully happens. Like, evolution doesn't happen in a direction of perfect harmony. It's just dynamic systems always changing and engaging with each other. But if, like, you look at the cosmological archetype of Aquarius, it's air, but it's the most complex and subtle, because it's the last air sign of the zodiac, where it's like, literally, when I think about Aquarius, I think about the atmosphere, and it's air, it's complex, and it's information, and it's global. And so all of those things together sound a lot like the internet to me. And even, like, when I think about the Aquarian archetype, I think of, like, bright white and blue light, which is like what we have on our cell phones and our faces every day, So I feel like there are these, I guess both of my responses have to do with cycles, understanding time in a cyclical kind of spiraling way, where it's not a circle, but it is a cycle, and it, like, kind of emerges in spirals that we can understand through deep time, through understanding deep time, and really listening to our ancestors, and also really listening to the future beings. That's one of the practices that Joanna Macy does, is listening to our descendants, listening to the seventh generation beyond us, and hearing what they would be saying about how we are living today. So we're at this precise time, and I haven't studied this aspect of astrology all that much, but I do understand that people say that we're in the age of Aquarius, and I understand that, like, that's information, and it's sharing our minds. And literally having satellites to instantaneously connect us across the globe through the airwaves. It's amazing. I mean, we're doing that right now through Skype. It's phenomenal. So that's one piece of it. And I'm sure anybody who's studied this more in depth would have much more to say about that. And similarly, I'm not an expert on the Kala Chakra Tantra, but my academic advisor was. And the Kala Chakra Tantra is the Buddhist Tantra that Shakyamuni Buddha taught. That is a very esoteric, very complex text that has a lot of mystery around it. And it's pretty difficult to understand, but it's the Wheel of Time Tantra. And my academic advisor was John Newman, and I was really blessed to have him. I was his last ever student before he retired. And he's one of the foremost Western scholars who's an expert on the Kala Chakra Tantra. And what I've learned from him, and also from studying Joanna Macy's analysis and commentary on the Shambhala prophecy, because the Shambhala prophecy is within the Kala Chakra Tantra. And the Kala Chakra Tantra is all kind of very prophetic, and it's all about time cycles. But the Shambhala prophecy, a lot of people have identified that we're living the Shambhala prophecy right now, which is that there will come a time when the danger to Buddha nature, enlightened ways of living, and to life will become so intense. The danger will become so incredibly powerful, and so many people will have strayed and forgotten the true nature of all of our inherent Buddha nature, and have forgotten the Dharma, and will have forgotten the Sangha, and will have completely forsaken so much. And, even though you and I are like immersed in satsang all the time, there are billions of people on this planet who are so lonely and so disconnected and so far removed from any sense of meaning or purpose or spiritual connection in their lives. And in the prophecy, it's like everybody's going to be, super diseased and just deeply disconnected, like all these things, like the four horsemen kind of stuff that I think anyone at any point in time can identify. Like, these things are at play always. So maybe it's an archetypal time thing that can be tapped into at any point. But within the prophecy, it says, there will be the Shambhala warriors will emerge, and they don't come from a specific place, but they come from a specific place of consciousness. And during this time of greatest discord, greatest suffering, it is the time when we have strayed so far from our truth and have the most potent capacity and potential for spontaneous enlightenment, for like Vajrayana kind of awakening, where somebody like Milarepa, who was a mass murderer, can become fully enlightened within that same lifetime. And that we live in this time of incredibly potent potential. And like you said, it's like there's not for many of us, there's not a solid foundation that we come into because that's the nature of the time that we're in right now. It's shaky, and it feels like the rug is being pulled out from under our feet every time we, pay attention to what's happening in our government, or pay attention to, the incredible upheaval of our planetary systems. All these things are like textbook examples of what it's like when systems change happens, when evolution is occurring within a large, complex system. Some things collapse, and new, more healthy, more integral systems have to emerge to take their place. It's just the only way that's possible. Mm-hmm. And I think an important question that we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of role do we see humanity having in a potential future? Because if you take a deep ecology, deep time look, like, the planet's going to be probably fine. Even if we do some of the worst case scenario things, there are forms of mycelium that will digest nuclear radiation. Like, they're doing it where we can know, like, okay, there are forms of fungi that can thrive in the most toxic, noxious environment. So, like, life on this planet will continue to exist. We have gone through many massive ecological upsets that have killed over 99% of life on the planet. And here we are, like, in incredible abundance and diversity. I'm not so worried about the planet as I am concerned that people aren't always asking themselves, what role do I want to have in humanity's future on this planet, and how hospitable do I want this planet to be to my own species?
Right. And that's again back to your particular foundation, though, like you're saying, is that you are standing in a place to make that choice. Mm-hmm. And now that part of what you're saying and what I'm understanding, what this guy was telling me about these ceremonies with the earth, is like the actual earth vibration is low because of the deterioration of human consciousness.
Yeah.
And because of the effects of humanity, just like too much human traffic in these wild places. Mm-hmm. And so having the foundation to be able to make a choice about how I want to be involved in that. And I think that that's part of that despairing energy that we're talking about that's out there right now, is that people maybe aren't finding that solid ground to be on, to be able to feel that they can make that choice. And also what I like about how you're relating to it in terms of time and that spiral and the possibility of it being a cycle. And so that gives a little more space, but again, maybe that's where the wildness is now. Maybe you have to have it all documented, but the wildness is just in the energy of the time, and that there isn't a whole lot of solid ground to stand upon. Mm-hmm. Outside of the self. And so that would make sense that that would be the grist for the mill, or the friction needed for the spontaneous awakening of whomever.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, like, the suffering is so intense, and that I think correlates to the intensity of the longing. But
see, I'm so irritated with this 12 step and the 12-step idea of bottoming out. I'm irritated with that. And I'm irritated, but I'm irritated with the apocalypse. There's an entire Christian movement, the Left Behind movement. There's a whole idea that that's what we're aiming for, is that we're going to wipe off half, and then this group is going to get to ascend. And so I'm feeling personally like they really are just coexisting, and it is more of an internal choice of how you want to perceive where we actually are in time.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I think for me, it's really helpful to use the Buddhist cosmological framework of the realms, which I think a lot of people interpret them as, maybe as like, there's an actual hell realm and there's an actual heaven realm, which maybe if you're into like seeing things in different dimensions, maybe there are different dimensional realms. But what I'm able to see, and I think everyone I've ever talked to totally agrees with this, is that like there are hell realms on this planet, and there are God realms on this planet. And the God realms are not realms of enlightened people. They're realms of people who've had good enough karma to warrant a place where they don't have to be reminded of suffering, and they can just spend eons in the traditional understanding is that you can spend eons in a God realm and everything's wonderful. There's music, there's beautiful food, there's beautiful people. The landscape is gorgeous. It's really nice. It's like, all these beautiful destination vacation places for the ultra wealthy in our world. That I see those as God realms. And it's really interesting because when your time is up in the God realm, when your karma has kind of all been used up because you haven't been dedicating it to anything other than your own pleasure, then you start to smell a little bad. Smell is really important in Tibetan Buddhism. And actually, like when you say Tibetan Buddhist prayers, a lot of the time in English, you say the word stainless, like it's so pure and clean, the stainless Dharma, the stainless whatever. But actually, the direct translation is that it has no smell, like no bad smell. so the Tibetan is just like a very nasally oriented, kind of sensory culture. And so in the God realms, you start to smell kind of sour, and everyone just shuns you and rejects you, and until you're all alone, and then you drop and fall into maybe the demigod realm, or maybe the human realm, or maybe the animal realm, wherever it is that your karma brings you next. And similarly, like in the hell realms, I think that we can all imagine what the hell realms are on our planet right now. They're sweatshops. They're the massive number of people who are in actual slavery, even though we don't call it that in our world right now. There are people often very, the incarceration population of America is massive. And a lot of those people are living in a hell realm. But what's possible in a hell realm is also like consciousness is possible there. And the Buddha actually had this moment, one of the earliest moments of enlightenment, the seeds for enlightenment for the Buddha was many, many lifetimes before he was the prince. He was just this wretch in a really disgusting hell realm. I won't go into the description. It's horrific, but he was doing this really disgusting, awful manual labor. And there was somebody who had connected karma to him that was next to him doing the same labor. And it was so horrific and so strenuous. And the Buddha looked over and he offered to take on that person's labor in addition to his own, so that person could rest for a moment. He had that moment of consciousness and awareness despite all the suffering that he was in. And that compassion, the overseer of the prison or of the hell realm looked at him and said something like, no one can escape their own karma. And he raised his whip and he went to hit the Buddha with the whip. And in that moment, the Buddha's consciousness completely flipped and he was transported into another realm. And he didn't have to experience that pain because it came from bodhicitta, from the desire to serve others.
Right.
So like I relate to, like, there are days when I'm in a Donald Trump America where I look around and everyone I'm encountering is so kind to one another and is so present and so loving and so compassionate, and it's not fake, it's so real. And I can say to myself with full honesty, wow, like world peace is really strong today. Like world peace is here. It's happening.
Yeah,
it's totally here. I'm in this realm where I am a human, and that's the beauty of a human life. It's not that the precious human life is, all lives are precious, because a lot of lives are not deemed precious by circumstance, by the people around them. A lot of lives are deeply devalued. And I think a lot of people struggle with this aspect of Buddhist philosophy of like, well, some people don't consider a human life precious, and some people are like, I'd much rather be my dog who doesn't have to worry about taxes. But when you dive into the detailed study of this, a precious human life is a life in which you have exactly what you were saying about me, where you have the good fortune to have a stable family. You have the good fortune to have access to the Dharma. You have relatively good health. I've had, difficulties, like we all have difficulties, but it's not been disastrous. You have, there's like, I think like 8, Tibetan Buddhism loves lists, and there's a specific number of qualities that you contemplate your precious human life. And so it doesn't apply to every human, but every human has the opportunity to create the conditions for more precious human lives. And I think regardless of our stories and regardless of the very real instances of oppression that different people born into different bodies and different lives can experience, we all have the ability to create in our own unique way the conditions for more of that precious human life. And we can also, like, it's not, I don't believe in like determinism at all. I think that we have free will, and I think that we have the ability to create peace on earth in every single moment, in every single interaction that we have, but it has to start within ourselves, of course.
Right. And so holding, and being able to hold multiple realms at one time, really might be part of what we're talking about now. And with the picture of the spiral and and being able to flow in and out of those different realms. And and so you are going through this moment right now, this massive transitional moment that all of us go through at some point in our lives. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get too into it right now, but just curious about your reflection on that as a part of a family unit. Mm-hmm. And you have a sister, right? Mm-hmm. So the transition out of the male head of that unit, I'm curious about how that's resonating for you in not just in basic gender, but just in that role of the masculine presence.
Yeah, this has been actually a really, thank you for asking that, because this has been a really interesting topic. Not so much between my sister and I, but between my father and I. Of my sister, my mother, and myself, I've been spending the most time with him. My parents divorced when I was like 13, and it was a loving separation, but there's definitely just boundaries and space between them. And my sister lives in Alaska, so she has not been able to be here all that much. So I have become really especially close with him in the dying process, and a lot of our conversations about the pain and the wounding that we've both experienced in our family. Like every family's fucked up, and every family has resentments and suffering and patterns that cause pain. And so my father and I've been we've really been trying to be proactive in unpacking and addressing those things so that we don't repeat this karma in future lives. And a big point of pain for him, and I feel comfortable talking about this because it'll actually be in the second edition of his book, which he's editing and putting together now, that'll be published after he passes, is when he was really young, he was a boy raised in post-war Germany, and boys have, it sucks for girls, but it also really sucks for boys to be raised in this culture, in this world. And he had the shit beaten out of him like all the time by other boys. He was really physically abused, really psychologically and emotionally abused by these other little German boys. And no one was helping him. No one was standing up for him. Everyone was just like, that's what it is to be a boy, and you just have to man up, And there was one day he was walking home from school, and there was a fence that had a hedge on the other side of it. So he couldn't see through it, but he could hear a bunch of little girls around his age, he assumed, playing with each other in a really soft and sweet and gentle way that was really loving, and talking to each other and playing and laughing and singing, and not playing war, not embodying violence, not hurting one another. And he felt, there was the hedge and the fence, and then his own body as a boy, where he was all these barriers that kept him from being able to access that. That created a story that at the time was real, but it was repeated throughout his life, where he could not be allowed to be a participant in that kind of sweetness. And among women specifically. And it's so interesting because I think that you understand this, but some of the listeners might not understand how Maharaji really took the people, the Westerners who got to know him, and it's like he twisted fate, and he just added some fairy dust and twisted their fate, but based off of seeds that were already inside of them. Didn't just like Larry Brilliant didn't just go off and do everything he's done. He was a doctor for it. He made choices, and he had stories about himself that created the fertile ground through which Maharaji could plant whatever seeds needed to be planted. and for his own growth. And Raghu was in radio, and Parvati had studied like literature and book editing. And, everybody had their own, and obviously Krishna Das was like in a rock band. And 2 days ago, I was laying in bed next to my dad, and I realized that I think that one of the biggest things that Maharaji did with him was give him my mom and my sister and I, and now his incredible wife, Durga, as these phenomenal examples of sweet, soft, feminine love. We are women who love other women. We don't have this like competitive, aggressive edge. We have an amazing sense of sisterhood. When we first met Durga, we immediately felt like so connected with her as well. So there's not like a sense of discord or disconnection between the women in his life. But it's so interesting because until very recently, until like just the last few months, he has never been able to fully receive or appreciate us. And we're like amazing people. My mom is one of the most phenomenal women in the world. My sister is so brilliant. Durga is like incredibly talented. And, KK invited her to come and like study in depth with him. Like she's so gifted. And something about his story of masculinity kept his ego from just melting into the juicy feminine Shakti that he's focused on his whole life. His whole spiritual practice is about the divine feminine. It's about the mother. It's about all of these things. And he has lived it in such a beautiful way in ritual and ceremony and writing a book about it and like all of this stuff. But when it comes to the interpersonal thing, and I think also like he's an Aquarius astrologically, that's his sun sign. And I find that that Aquarians who are somewhat masculine often have like a beautiful worldview and not necessarily ease in applying it interpersonally. And that was our experience with him. And it's been amazing this last month of his life. He might be passing in the next few days, in the next few weeks. It could be a month or two. He just kind of took a turn for the more withdrawn from the world. And I'm just so grateful that we've had this time of exploration and, as he's dropping his body, and this body that is tall and German and hairy and physically imposing and has always dominated the space whatever space he's in, not because he wants it to, but because it's so big, like his body is shrinking, he's just limbs right now. And soon the body won't exist except as ashes. And when that happens, he and I both have it's like a full understanding. We fully understand this about each other, that like I'll be able to feel him everywhere. And it's not that I won't grieve. I have grief every day, but without a body, there's so much more depth of connection that's possible, because the body holds so many stories that keep us from receiving the divine love and the divine intelligence that's all around us. And my experience with death, I've had in the last 7 years, somebody really important to me die every year of my life in the last 7 years. And it's allowed me to have this over time, this like really in-depth study of death. And I just think the dying process is hard. It's often ugly. It's deeply uncomfortable for our egos. But when death happens itself, if we're open to it, and no judgment if you're not open to it, but if you are open to it, there's like this incredible swirling of energy that happens, this like vortex of creation, of like release and relief. And I feel it in like the plants around me. I feel it in the world around me, like in a pretty tangible way. 2 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, actually, 2 students died on our college campus of heroin overdoses. And it was so shocking and so difficult. It's a very psychedelic campus, but like it was a huge surprise to any of us that heroin was present on the campus. Now we understand that it's a global and especially national crisis, but when that happened, the love that exuded from like the buildings and the pathways and the lampposts and the individuals on the whole campus was unlike, I mean, it was the most ecstatic, phenomenal, transcendent experience that I've ever had in my life. And I was like raised doing weird, religious ceremonies, but like death is so potent and so much a part of life. And it can be so beautiful, and it has been so beautiful with my father. And I really hope that we can create a world in which more people are comfortable with that possibility.
And you were speaking about receptivity and that spiral and being able to have that depth of connection. And again, this goes back to the whole theme of this conversation is, that each of those letting goes, those softenings, going on the other side of the hedge, whichever hedge it is, that you're on, whatever side you're on, and being able to be vulnerable and offer that piece of yourself outside of the body in all of its trappings, or outside of the presentation, and being able to expose that aspect of yourself first to yourself and then to others. And then from there making your choice about how you want to perceive, how you want to see, which realm you want to see right now, which realm would you like to be in.
Yeah. And I think a really important thing to add is to not use that as an excuse for spiritual bypassing, and not to get into a place of like, oh, I'm just going to be in like the happy realm all the time. Like, I'm just going to be in the world peace all the time, because it's like we can go there and we can abide there and we can try to make it bigger. Like, we can try and make what we experience as world peace more inclusive. Like, even, like actual tangible actions, like having, like the foundation has, amazing scholarship opportunities for young people to be able to access this. That's making world peace bigger. That's making sure it's not just baby boomers who are able to come to the retreats, because we in my generation can't afford things like that most of the time. So there's we can make world peace bigger, but then also we need to go into the places of hell realms, or at least bear witness to them.
Just as I did, for some reason, I never understood this until this moment, but you can only spiritual bypass in the mind. I mean,
yeah,
if you're actually in your heart,
yeah,
there's no room for bypass, which is kind of a funny use of that word, because that's where people have bypass surgery. Literally have bypass surgery to go around the blockages in their heart, which, as a seeker, as someone who's on a path, as someone whose intention is to become more present and to become more loving, it really is that going into the heart, the head to the heart, as our teacher says over and over again. And sometimes sitting in a seated practice or even a walking practice isn't going to bring you back into the heart, but that something tangible, like that being with the earth, or being with another person, being in bed with your, with your sick father, like being in that proximity. So this is back to the medicine that you're offering right now, of this, in the cloud and on the ground, sharing your words, sharing from your heart into the internet, and then finding those actual expanding on those actual connections in the world, whether it's with a person or with a plant or with a building on your campus that's, resonating in that moment. I just think it's so cool that our happy participant in the legacy of your family and of your father's work and it's just such a radical time and a moment in my life that I've never had any intention for this to be a focal point of my existence. Always was spiritually inclined, always felt myself to be a being of light. I was raised Christian, Lutheran, very conservative, and always connected through music and nature to something other, but never knew anyone who was their pursuit. Never saw it as a lifestyle or any of that kind of stuff. And so for me to be able to sit here and be in reflection to people across generations that are truly devoted to this exploration is just so radical. Yeah. It's so cool.
Yeah. And there's so many of us. Like, it's amazing. I mean, it's everywhere I go. I know that it's not, I really want to make sure that I don't get into a place of thinking that, I don't want to get into like an echo chamber of like, I'm only surrounded by people who think just like me, but I'm in such awe everywhere I go that I meet people my age whose whole lives are devoted to really living in the heart and really understanding the subtle energies going on around like everything that the planet is going through and that our species is going through. And the coolest thing is that people are embodying like a consciousness of more abundance that is taking away the scarcity that tells us that life is a zero-sum game, that, there are winners and losers.
So, all right. So I ask everyone that I talk to give a specific piece of advice to women and girls on the spiritual path. I'll leave that for you.
I think that the best advice I could give anyone is to just find your own unique relationship with the elemental forces all around us, whether it's having a practice of going outside and gazing at the moon every day. Today we're recording on a new moon, which feels like a lot of emptying's been happening. And I've benefited greatly from a relationship with the moon that has helped me to understand the cycles of time and of my own body and my own consciousness. Or if it's, going outside and touching the earth every day, or if it's developing a sacred relationship with fire, and tending fire and having whatever practice that is for you. Or also, I strongly always recommend the practice of offering your reproductive blood, your moon blood, to the earth and putting that into the earth and developing a really in-depth sacred relationship between your body and the body of the planet. I think that beyond any specific spiritual practice from a different cultural tradition, which I'm like really thoroughly versed in, that's the most important thing to me, is my own personal relationship with the tangible aspects of the world around us that are a reflection of our body. And in your last episode, I was just listening to it this morning with Lama Tsultrim. She's saying how the treatment of the earth is always reflective of the treatment of women in a culture. And I think our ancestors, the women who have gone long before us, are like asking us to not connect with any cultural trappings of anything, but just connect to the planet around us that is our body.
Well, Ganga, this has been wonderful. You've got a great mind and a brilliant heart, and I'm so grateful that you took time to share it with me and everybody listening here.
Thank you.
And just if you want to let us know, for those that are listening that are a part of the Sangha or otherwise, what how best to be in touch with you, or how you want people to connect with you.
Yeah, well, because we started this way, I'm happy to give a shout out to my Instagram account, which is GANGA__DEVI. I didn't even know about the network until I met you in Ojai. And,
oh, really? Oh, good.
Yeah. And I was just like, oh, whoa, that's cool. And it's so amazing that you're doing this about women, that just about Shakti, because I actually mentioned this to my dad yesterday. And I'm like, oh, tomorrow I'm being interviewed for this podcast, which is so cool. It's on the network. And he was like, oh, that's nice. Because he was like, because, Ram Dass, he's terrified of the divine feminine.
Oh, really? Wow.
And I was like, yeah, it's cool. Like, we're having these conversations.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So we'll have all links to all that on the Shakti Hour page, and you guys can check it out there. And thanks very much, Ganga.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.